The history of mythicism. If you wanted to understand where mythicism plays a role in history, this will be an interesting topic. He's not arguing for or against historicity or mythicism, but he's going to take you into the history. Christopher Hansen. He's read over 200 books. A lot of sources get named here, and if you go down in the description, you will see a lot of these sources listed for you guys to be able to investigate yourself if you're interested. I hope you guys enjoy this video because all of our biases can sometimes come out, and Christopher Hansen did a really good job, in my opinion, of not being overly biased against mythicism, even though he documents the history as best he can in this documentation. I hope you guys liked the video. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell, and comment down below your thoughts of the history of mythicism, maybe your thoughts about what Christopher Hansen has to say about mythicism. I'm interested in hearing what you have to say, and if you guys want to, you can join Myth Vision by becoming a patron. We are Myth Vision. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I have Christopher Hansen today. What's up, my brother?
Not much. Just working on a whole bunch of research for stuff that nobody knows about.
That's what it sounds like to me. I said, we got to get all Myth Vision fans to check this out because, first of all, a lot of people who watch my show are mythicists. A lot of them are historicists. They have various degrees of thought of what this means and who the guy was or what he's based off of. And there's a variety of different things. And I figure what better than to spin off the title you and me came up with. And what are we going to title this show?
The Quest for the Mythical Jesus.
The Quest.
Playing off of Albert Schweitzer today.
Nice. I like that. So there's a history behind mythicism, at least as we know it. As far as we can see what mythicism is, that can be a broad range of things. So we'll go ahead.
So I think the first thing that we should talk about before we get really into the deep history is that the term mythicism is actually a pretty problematic one, just in general. So when we're trying to analyze the historical roots of mythicism, it's good to try and figure out what mythicism actually should be categorized as. So the first thing I'm going to just talk about here is just how do I categorize it? When it comes to mythicism specifically, I argue that we should only define it as those who deny the historical existence of Jesus. And that is denying all kinds of a historical Jesus. So there are going to be people like G.R.S. Mead, as we'll see, and Alvar Ellegard, who argue that there might have been a historical figure in the distant past, or he was historical and he was like 100 years before, or there are going to be others that think he was a composite figure based on historical figures, or that he was a completely different figure, some arguing that he was like a son of Julius Caesar and stuff like that.
Okay, pause 1 second. You just like loaded us with some really interesting things. I want to, let me just point out something that's interesting. So this falls into the category, the category we talked about last time when you were with Dr. Price about this. This was really interesting. If someone thinks that he's kind of a blend of different historical characters, that falls into this category you're going to say?
Nope.
Okay, it doesn't.
All of those are going to be, in my opinion, a version of a historicist.
Okay. Got it.
Because they think that there's a historical core. Now, there are going to be composite theorists that do think that he's all mythical and based off just mythical figures. There are also going to be composite theorists that think that he's a blend of mythical and historical figures, in which case the lines of historicity and mythicism become very much blurred. Mythicism is the positive position that there is no historical Jesus. They make an affirmative argument that there was no historical Jesus. So mythicists are going to include people like Dr. Richard Carrier, or or other figures of history like Arthur Dreves, Albert Kalthoff, Bruno Bauer, these kinds of figures. Then there's going to be a lesser version of that, which is going to be a Jesus agnostic. Jesus agnostics can kind of, favor one side or another, but their ultimate position is that we can't make any firm conclusions either way. So is it fair
to, I have to say, is it fair to say, as much as Dr. Price has written on the Christ myth theory,
he also has told me, we're not certain. Like, he's like, there could have been a guy, and I'm just not aware of it. I just don't think we have enough evidence. He doesn't believe the evidence for him is good enough. So could he be agnostic, or would you put him in the category of Dr. Carrier? Because him and Dr. Carrier agree in a lot of ways too. So
Yeah, with Dr. Price, I am personally reserved about actually categorizing him in this because he's preferred a completely different term, just in
okay,
general. He Dr. Price, as I understand it, and as I've read from his material, prefers to actually be called a New Testament minimalist, basically following the lines of the Copenhagen school of biblical minimalism, like Thomas L. Thompson and people like that.
interesting.
So in that line, I think he'd be closer to probably an agnostic.
Okay,
The minimalists are generally along those lines as well. So like Thomas L. Thompson is part of the Copenhagen school at the university. It was at the University of Copenhagen. That's where he taught. And he is officially, to my knowledge, agnostic on the topic of Jesus's existence. Another figure who's actually very well known now, has a peer-reviewed book on the subject, is Raphael Ladister. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly.
he's agnostic, right?
Yeah. He's completely agnostic on the subject. His book is in favor of agnosticism, primarily, though he does have a passage that is in favor of mythicism, but he officially takes an agnostic stance. Hector Avalos also takes an agnostic stance as well.
Interesting.
So then there's so then from there, I categorize different types of historicists. There is the traditional historicist, which is what I am. We think that there was an identifiable Jesus, somewhat as the Gospels described, crucified, etc., etc.
Okay. Basic. Would you consider it like a minimal historicity? Like even
a minimal historicity, as I think Carrier would define it. And then there is, after that, there are identity historicists. Identity historicists, they think that Jesus was real, but he's a different figure. So Lena Einhorn thinks that Jesus was the Egyptian prophet, for example. Then there are those that think that Jesus was the composite figure that we already talked about. And then there are temporal historicists who think Jesus existed, but that he existed in a different time frame, which is also a part of Lena Einhorn's theory. Lena Einhorn's theory is that the entire Gospels were time shifted.
I actually interviewed her. It was a good interview, but yeah, interesting theory.
Yeah. So there are a lot of different theories out there. There's also Luigi Cascioli. Before he passed away, he thought that the historical figure behind everything was John of Gamala. Others have thought he was Judas the Galilean. One figure we'll look at today also thought that he was Barabbas. So there's a whole wide variety, and then there's one other category, which are race theorists. I'm not going to focus on them as much today because it's much more of a hot button issue, but they are generally aligned with taking different historicist or mythicist approaches based off of racial ideology.
Can you give a name of a few of those, like the groups, or?
On the side of white supremacists, there are figures like Revelio Oliver. There was Ben Klassen and the Church of the Creator. The Church of the Creator is an actual white supremacist religion that holds Jesus did not exist as part of its doctrine. It is the work that you read in that is extremely hard to read from personal experience, having to read
like
through
it's very bad, like just really.
It is very bad.
Wow.
The theory is basically that Jesus never existed, and he was an invention by the Jews in order to destroy the Roman Empire. It gets pretty absurd sometimes. There's also those then on a completely different side, which are the Afrocentric scholars. There's a number of them actually still around today in universities, and they argue usually for either that Jesus didn't exist, or that he may have been an African, or that he was identified with an African figure. So there's one that actually argued that Jesus was King Tut.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, those can get pretty interesting as well. Those both of these groups in the race theorists cliques, basically,
Yeah.
usually never are criticized or talked about by other academics. They're, for the most part, pretty much ignored. They're about the only group, besides them, and then as we'll also see, women, they're about the only ones that are really just actively ignored by academics. So with that, now that we have our categories set, when we're going to talk about today, I'm going to primarily focus on mythicism. Positive, and I'll also talk about agnosticism as well, because those two are generally pretty closely related.
Right.
So what I'm going to go through is try and trace it from our earliest sources to the present, in basically a broad view for everyone. And then anytime we want to zoom in, feel free. And we can do so.
If you're biased, get rid of him now, because he's gonna dig up some bones, boys.
Oh, there's going to be a lot of bones dug up, and there's going to be a lot of things that both historicists and mythicists alike have liked to say in the past that are, by and large, just false.
Okay.
From what I've determined, there are a lot of a lot of like clickbaity things that are just not correct at all about the history of mythicism.
Okay. I want to say up front before you get into this, because this is going to be really a good, interesting history, and you're going to give us an airplane view. If we can zoom in, we will. For anyone who's watching this, if you haven't noticed so far on Myth Vision, this is not mythicist vision, okay? This is myth vision. We look at mythology. I myself came to the mythicist conclusion from, I'd say, more of an allegorical approach, and I started to apply that in the New Testament. Didn't realize that you can still have mythology and have your Jesus, right? There could be a guy. It doesn't necessitate that. And I just want to say to the audience who's watching, Myth Vision is a journey, guys. We're on a journey to try and understand what's really going on. We really want to find the guy, okay? If there is one, we're not going to beat around the bush. We're not going to play games. We're not going to say there couldn't have been, because no, we really want to look and try and understand. And at the end of the day, if we don't have sufficient evidence to be concluding something, I'm not going to do it. However, I really do want to search and find the guy. I want to understand. And sometimes I also want to know why I became a mythicist, or where did this movement that I got into come from? What are the differing ideas? So that being said, I'm here to entertain someone who is not a mythicist, in fact, writes against mythicism. And why would I do that? Am I not a religious nut that's a tinfoil hat wearing mythicist? Since, no, I'm agnostic on the question. I'd fit into some of these categories probably, but willing to change my mind for sure as I research. So I just want to say that up front for anyone watching. Thank you for coming on and sharing this with us. And I'm interested in hearing what you have to teach me.
Okay. So with this, let's just start. First, I'm just going to dispel a few claims of earlier antecedents of mythicism. There are a few claims that we can trace it early on and stuff like that. So, for example, it's very common for people on the mythicist side to argue that in Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho, that Trypho says Jesus doesn't exist when he says you invent a Christ for yourself. I personally do, in my research, with my book I'm writing on this topic, don't consider this valid, because I think that Trypho is just talking about the Christ in general as the Messiah. He's saying they're inventing a Christ, not a Jesus. I think that there are two Russian scholars that basically handled this problem fairly well and showed it was that trend was just incorrect. For those that are wondering, Alexander Men, and then not a Russian, but an English scholar who was a communist, Archibald Robertson. These books are The Son of Man and The Origins of Christianity for those that are interested. They're a little bit hard to come by. Origins of Christianity is easier. Son of Man has only been printed in English once in the 90s, so it's a little harder to come by, but it's definitely worth the read. So I'm not going to be considering Trypho in this. So when we get to more modern times and actually trying to theorize about this, there was a claim going around that there were two different popes that were mythicists. One of them, believe it was Pope Paul III. He was polemicized in a work by a Frenchman named de Cormenin. And what happened was that there was a big trend that developed out of that of people claiming that this Pope was a mythicist. The problem is that there's actually no evidence that what de Cormenin wrote was actually went back to the time of that Pope. But it still caught on. So in the works of Guy Fawkes, who's a French mythicist in the 60s, he copied this down and tried to spread this out. And then there are some of the Greek mythicists today tend to spout this. It's an unsubstantiated claim. We cannot actually substantiate this as true.
If you don't mind me just zooming in a little, this Pope that they're claiming was a mythicist, when did that Pope exist?
In the 1500s.
Okay.
Another Pope in the 1500s that that has been occasionally claimed to be a mythicist is Leo X. Pope Leo X was towards the latter half of the 1500s. Unfortunately, the only evidence we have of this is a work by John Bale, who was a very anti-papal figure, and he was very well known for polemicizing them.
So he could have been being derogatory in a sense.
Exactly.
Right? Okay.
Well, and then what he said also, what he claimed that Leo X said is also really ambiguous, because he says that this fable of Christ has been very profitable for us. The problem is that it's really hard to tell what fable of Christ actually means, because we have no context to go with it.
Even if, and this is another thing, you got a good point there, even if one thought the Christ was a fable, I mean, I think it's a fable, doesn't mean there wasn't a historical guy that was built on him. So, okay, got it.
So there's a whole lot of problems trying to actually interpret that. And there's also then the problem of, is it even legitimate? Did the Pope even say that? I don't think he did. I think that it's just a polemic. So the first confirmed reference I can find to someone that was either a mythicist or agnostic, it's hard to tell which, is in the work of Edward Stillingfleet in 1677. Edward Stillingfleet was a theologian, and he wrote against deists of that. Basically, the earliest critics of the church were usually either deists or pantheists in some way, or usually like super early developing liberal Christians in some way. So this deist he doesn't name. There are a few theories as to who this is, but they're hard to get into, and I'm not going to do it here. But anyways, this deist wrote against the authenticity of Tacitus, against the authenticity of Josephus, and then seemed to argue that Jesus did not exist as a historical figure. And Edward Stillingfleet, luckily for us, preserved some quotes from what he said, and then also what we have are his rebuttals. And so Stillingfleet goes through an entire list of arguments for why this deist is wrong. Unfortunately, we don't have the deist's work itself left. We only have what's preserved in Edward Stillingfleet. So I am hesitant to categorize him as either a mythicist or agnostic. I leave him open for either category. But he seems to think that there may not have been a historical Jesus at all. And this would be the earliest figure then that seems to indicate this. The next earliest references we start to have are then Thomas Woolston, who seemed to cast doubt on the historicity of Jesus, but he's also really inconsistent with his own views, because he liked to have these weird metaphorical exposés on the Gospels just in general, and it becomes really hard to actually figure out what he is saying at times. But some commentators do think that he was casting doubt on the historicity of Jesus. So I tend to take those views and be charitable in that direction. Another very early trend was actually to claim that Quakers were mythicists. This was a polemic usually done by Protestants of the day, and it was basically to demonize Quakers at any chance they got. So in the work of Moshe Lorenz, there is a polemic, and they're claiming that the Quakers only believed that Jesus existed in the hearts of the faithful. And this polemic was continued for about a century, almost verbatim. It looked like it was a stock polemic of some kind that everyone just knew and used to discredit them. Continuing on from that, the first active mythicist that we can confirm, in my opinion, was in the work of referenced in the work of Voltaire. Towards the end of his life, Voltaire wrote one book where he records that followers of Lord Bolingbroke, who was an English deist, came to him one day and wrote that they had discovered that Jesus probably never existed, and their main arguments were actually based off of the contradicting genealogies in Luke and Matthew. Voltaire was not very kind to them. Voltaire referred to them as more ingenious than learned. And he then actually wrote an entire rebuttal to them on why Jesus probably existed. And it's worth noting this specifically with Voltaire, because Voltaire was no ally of Christianity by any means. He was pretty against Christian authority in a lot of ways. These guys that Voltaire records, these are our earliest mythicists on record. Unfortunately for us, it doesn't look like they actually had any influence outside of this. Voltaire's the only one to mention them. It doesn't look like they were around very long, or their ideas may have just died with them. If they did spread, it was not in our, they're not recorded at all after that point. So actually, where our main start of mythicism as something that everyone basically just started endorsing and stemming their ideas from, actually began starting with the works of Constantin Comte de Volnay in France and his friend Charles-François Dupuy. Constantin Volnay was the earliest one to publish, but he wasn't the first one of those two to write. So, I'll start with Volnay just because he published first. Volnay's work was primarily based off of drafts of Dupuy's work. Volnay, though, unlike Dupuy, was not actually a mythicist, despite what Bart Ehrman, Robert Van Voorst, and even other mythicists have claimed. He was not actually a mythicist himself. He actually did think that there was a historical figure, and he primarily thought that because of the idea of messianism necessitated that they would have believed in a historical figure of some kind. For those that are interested in this, George Albert Wells has wrote an excellent paper in the 1960s summarizing Dupuy and Volnay's views, where he specifically noted that Volnay was not a mythicist at all. This is one of those trends for mythicists and historicists alike that just needs to end.
So question, this is a good stopping point for real quick, just to get where we're at in history. What year is this?
We're in the early 1790s now.
Okay.
Bolingbroke's followers are in the 1760s. The polemics from the Quakers are from the early 1700s to the late 1700s and early 1800s, around there. In between there, also just throughout there are also scattered possible references to mythicists also in French and German work. I won't get into them because they're just like side mentions, they're really tiny, but it's just worth noting that they are there.
So there's a developing idea, so to speak, that could be going on, or trends of ideas that are going on with this. Okay.
And they seem to circulate primarily among deists of the day.
Oh, okay. Okay. You're good.
So in terms of to show this, Bolingbroke's followers were deists. The earliest mythicist / agnostic we have is a deist, and then Volney and Dupuy were deists as well. So Volney's work is notable, not specifically because he's a mythicist, but because of how influential the work became. He wrote Les Ruines des Empires, which basically the ruins of the empires. It's a work that became extremely famous because actually our later American president, Thomas Jefferson, translated it into English, removed his name from it, and then had published it with the help of Joel Barlow. Joel Barlow was also an early activist and basically a proto-free thought activist in a way. And so basically with the help of Thomas Jefferson, his work became influential throughout the English-speaking world. Ironically, despite the fact that it had influence in the French Revolution, later on, Volney's work kind of just disappeared in his home France. Same as also Dupuy's work. Dupuy's work had actually a lot less influence than Volney's because it was so much larger, in my opinion. Volney's work is actually pretty accessibly small. Like Dupuy's work is a massive tome. It's like Carrier's book-sized tome.
Oh wow, okay.
So basically, because of Thomas Jefferson, Volney's work got disseminated, and so this is where mythicism just spreads like that, as an idea. So after that point, I know for a fact that Thomas Paine, the famous philosopher who inspired our founding fathers and their philosophy quite a lot, he was a mythicist. It's also worth noting all of these early mythicists were usually of the astrotheology kind.
That's what I was going to ask you about Reverend Robert Taylor and his
Yes.
Devil's Pulpit.
Yeah, I'm going to get to him actually pretty soon here.
Okay.
I'm going to start with the United States first because it's easier to get a handle on it. The English mythicists are a lot more complicated as a whole.
Okay.
So in the United States, I am pretty confident that Thomas Jefferson was a mythicist. There are records from people that had access to his letters, and then also some of his correspondences that strongly indicate that he probably was an astrotheological mythicist of some kind. Then there are, on top of that, we know that George Washington had all of Volney's work. You can actually find the records of it in the Washington Library. You can just look. You can look through the catalog of his personal library, and you'll find all Volney's work is there. You'll also find the responses to Volney's work there as well. Washington seemed to have very closely kept up with all of that debate.
Why would that be important to him? You know what I mean?
No, it's very it's interesting. Unfortunately, he did not leave any writings that I have found that would indicate he was a mythicist. At best, all I can say is that it was an interesting side thing he liked to read about.
Right.
We also know that later on, Abraham Lincoln also had Volney's work and read it. So we have at least 3 presidents that seem to have had some knowledge of this debate. And then where it actually spread the most and we have the most record of is actually among laity. And this is actually primarily where mythicism has stayed consistently throughout history, is among the laity in the world. The records primarily come from early free thought magazines and periodicals that were being published in the United States, and the same thing also in Europe. And so in these free thought periodicals and stuff, you find people usually writing anonymously or just under initials that are never clarified, that Jesus didn't exist in some way. Lots of them are usually astrotheological mythicists of some kind. In fact, the vast majority of them are. And so I have records of actually one specific mythicist who wrote probably some 15 or 20 articles in a single free thought journal over the span of a year in favor of mythicism. We don't know who it was. The person never signed their name, but they wrote them all under the same name, and it seemed like it was a continuation, almost like he was serializing a book, whoever this person was. And so this is basically what it was like in early United States, and this is like early 1800s now. Now, in the early 1800s in Europe, we have a very different matter because we know who was involved directly.
Okay.
We have our earliest major mythicists are Richard Carlisle, Robert Taylor, and then also a woman, Eliza Sharples. I'm specifically going to be noting Eliza Sharples here, and I'm going to actually put a lot of focus on women throughout this discussion because they are completely overlooked in this history, and they're completely overlooked today.
Like Acharya? I'm just saying.
Well, yeah, I mean, Acharya is the only one that actually gets regular reference at all. So I'm going to focus on them a bit. Okay. But basically, Richard Carlisle and Robert Taylor were our earliest figures majorly associated with it in England. They were part of the burgeoning free thought movements in England. There were quite a few of them starting to go around. There was Carlisle's group, and then there were also like the Owenites and a few others. And they were predominantly popular among the working class. E.P. Thompson has a great book on this, so I highly suggest everyone just read that book. But basically what we end up finding throughout this is, first, an astrotheological argument for Jesus is consistent. These figures were primarily inspired by the astrotheological idea and arguments against the New Testament by Thomas Paine and by Volney. And then on top of this, they were usually also, they had their own innovations to a degree as well. There was a strong emphasis on comparative study. A lot more than Volney had, actually. So what you actually find are that most of the dying and rising gods, I don't think they exist, but most of these dying and rising gods that are usually used today were first prototyped in like the 1820s. So you find Attis, Adonis, Tammuz, and numerous other figures, all referenced by like Robert Taylor and Richard Carlisle. Another one that was popular among them was also Prometheus. Problem is that actually all their ideas about Prometheus derived not from ancient sources, but a modern poem that they thought was an ancient poem. So they had a complete,
I didn't know this.
Yeah, they had a complete error there. Yeah, the poem that they used was actually a modern one, and it's really funny. But they were pretty popular actually among the working class. Robert Taylor basically became a spectacle. He went on tours across England. He was originally actually a minister, an ordained minister, and he pretty quickly actually lost his faith, and then he became the devil's chaplain. And so he began publishing sermons from the devil's pulpit, and they're also called the astrotheological sermons. And he also published 2 books in favor of mythicism, and he also published a pamphlet. There was a pamphlet. The pamphlet in particular was a hot button issue, because what happened is when he published that pamphlet, and it's got one thing that they would do, because these were all a bunch of these are basically like every angsty atheist that's like just become an atheist like today.
Right.
He basically did a Martin Luther with this pamphlet, and he'd go and nail this mythicist pamphlet on the doors of churches and then in public squares. They would purposely go out of their way to piss everyone off.
Oh man.
And so that ended up getting him a number of responses. There's you can actually find most of them available in reprints.
Where do you go to get these prints?
You can just find these on Amazon.
Okay. Okay.
Everything I've gotten here, you can either find on Amazon or ABE Books. It does get a little harder with some of the older stuff I'll be showing everyone, though, because a lot of this has never been reprinted, because it's actually still not out of its copyright phase yet in the United States.
Okay.
So what ends up happening is you have these two really angsty dudes running around, printing a whole bunch of things and making everyone ticked off. And this is a very bad time in English history to be doing this, because around this same time are people passing legislation like the penny stamp tax, and then also things like arresting people for blasphemy en masse. So Robert Taylor and Richard Carlisle were regularly in and out of prison. And then on top of this, they were absolutely crap with money. Robert Taylor and Richard Carlisle were usually running their families into the ground, into poverty, quite regularly. This put a huge strain on Carlisle's relationship with his wife, Jane. Jane and his sister Mary were instrumental in running the business and making sure that he got his works published, making sure that his mythicist stuff got published, making sure that the periodicals like the Republican were published. And it was a huge strain on them, especially also because Richard Carlisle began just fooling around with a bunch of other women. So what we ended up having in this unfortunate period was that Jane and Richard basically eventually ended up separated. She still maintained the business, and it's usually theorized that she was doing it out of spite for the English government, not because she actually cared about anything that Richard was doing. But she also ended up being arrested a few times as well. In total, the number of people that were arrested as volunteers in this business and the amount of time that they were forced to serve amounted to around 200 years total. So during this period, though, after one of the tours, and then after they were all arrested and put in prison, Eliza Sharples had actually seen them on tour and then had borrowed the books from her cousin's personal library. And after Eliza Sharples' father died, she basically eventually actually turned into a free thought advocate and a early woman suffragist in England. This is in the 1830s for those wanting reference. So what ended up happening is Robert Taylor got put in prison for around 2 years because on blasphemy charges. So he couldn't be on tour anymore. And so when Carlisle got out after about 2 months, he had no one to basically be going around and touring and making money, and there was no one at the theater that Carlisle owned called the Rotunda. So what ended up happening is that first he approached this guy called John Ward, John Zion Ward. He was a figure that seems to have suffered some kind of problem mentally. Some have argued that it was possibly schizophrenia. He was convinced that he was an incarnation of both the devil and Christ. And he was convinced he was a prophet. He got a number of followers, actually. He had a surprising following early on, but he did not stay with Carlisle very long before he went on basically like a missionary tour of a sorts that was eventually shut down by the British military and ended up with an actual massacre. So again, Carlisle has no one running things, and so he gets Eliza Sharples. And Eliza, originally her identity was hid, and she was just called the Isis, and then she was also called the Pythoness of the Rotunda. And basically, Carlisle, despite having written a whole book on women's suffrage, he was a misogynistic piece of crap. He had no good relationship with any woman in his life, ever. He's frequently abusive, emotionally withholding, whole 9 yards. What he did with Eliza, who had fallen in love with him, and they became common law married, was that he basically marketed her almost like a circus show. But then on the other hand, he marketed her as the first woman lecturer in England on free thought, the first woman suffragist, and stuff like that. And basically had her repeating what Robert Taylor and Carlisle himself were doing. Sharples pretty quickly, though, seemed to actually just stop. We know from her notes eventually that she ended up just writing out a bunch of Taylor's stuff, started leaving all of Taylor's ideas eventually. But she was a mythicist. She held that Jesus did not exist in any historical form. She also held that none of the patriarchs existed. Moses didn't exist. She basically held that none of the Bible at all was historical, and that it was all a part of these deeper meanings and symbolical meanings that people had to actually wade through. And what ended up happening is that she developed an entire new religion. She called it rational Christianity. And
ooh,
yeah,
I know some people who are just like that. I've actually had people on the show that are just like that.
her whole rational Christianity thing, we have the whole interpretation of the Gospels, the whole Bible, as basically symbolical and metaphorical in different ways, and basically illuminating aspects about her conception of God. What actually ended up happening is that after she started publishing her articles, she published them in a periodical that she herself edited called the Isis. And when she published those, Richard Carlisle, her then husband, actually made a public statement converting to her rational Christianity from atheism. And then Robert Taylor seemed to also have gotten involved as well. So she actually started an entire movement of rational Christians who didn't think Jesus existed. What eventually ended up happening was that Carlisle was arrested again. The business was basically forcibly shut down by the English government. The English government basically decided to actually just put a stamp on all of the free thought movements going around because they were causing a lot of problems with dissent against the authority of the government itself, especially because the English government was very much being condoned by the Anglican Church. So they put a stamper on it. Richard Carlisle was in and out of prison. Eliza Sharples basically was living in poverty. She had several kids at this point with Carlisle. Richard died fairly. He died in the 1840s and left Sharples basically destitute, with nothing to support her. So she basically had to live the rest of her life on the support of people that would give her money from the free thought movements around. She did though, and this is going to be important to note later, she did have connections to Charles Bradlaugh. Charles Bradlaugh at the time was a young teenager and actually came to live with her for some time. He would later form some of the more notable free thought movements and become very influential to another mythicist, one of the most important mythicists of all history later. So there is actually a connection. So that's basically what it was like in early England. Early England is one of the few cases where mythicism was actively actually oppressed by authorities. In Germany, it's a fairly different story. We do have some indications that there may have been some mythicists early on in Germany in the 1700s and early 1800s. For example, in the 1830s, we know that there was a writing from an anonymous German Jew that was published in English in England. It was basically a series of letters arguing Jesus didn't exist. There was a mixture of comparative ideas that we've already seen, and then also arguments basically from a very biased Jewish perspective that Jesus didn't exist. But that was about it at that time. Then there was for Germany. The major figure that actually popped up on the scene was someone that actually popped up without connection to Volney or Dupuy. Completely independent, Bruno Bauer. Bruno Bauer originally began as actually a conservative Christian and a theologian, and entered academia basically to prove Christianity was true. He was also heavily influenced by the philosophy of Hegel. Just a side note, Hegel is the worst. Hegel is the root of all evil. However, he makes every bit of philosophy just...
Yeah,
Hegel just makes philosophy really complicated. But basically, other than he's influenced by Hegel, you don't really need to know the specifics for this video. Basically, Bruno Bauer eventually, though, developed more and more liberal tendencies, and eventually just came to the conclusion Jesus probably didn't exist. But his theory was completely different from what we had previously seen. He didn't rely on the comparisons between other deities. He didn't rely on astrotheology at all. His was an innovation in that he came to the conclusion that Jesus didn't exist because he thinks that what actually happened was that Jesus was an invention basically by Mark to fulfill the social wants and social tribulations of the communities of the time. He was also the person that would inspire the Dutch radicals later. He did not think any of the Pauline epistles were authentic. He did not think any of the Gospels were authentic. And a result from actually his work on the Gospels is what actually led to him being censored. Basically, after he had lost his faith and was starting to move in a more mythicist direction, he published a series of books arguing against the authenticity of the Gospels. And these works got the attention of his colleagues, and his colleagues basically sent a bunch of complaints to the higher ups in the government. And so the government of Germany initially just said that if he would stop teaching, they would fund his research as long as he just leave the university. And he said no, and kept teaching anyways. And it just went downhill from there because the government was like, okay, if you're not going to quit it, we're going to make you. And so they removed his teaching license. And so he was not allowed to teach. His ability to teach was revoked in the entirety of Germany at the time. At this time, it's actually the Prussian Empire, but Germany. So with that unfortunate event, he basically became a low working class citizen after that.
If you don't mind me, don't mind me asking here, we probably didn't touch on it because it's probably not really pertinent. I'm sure it was common that people were anti-Semitic and stuff, but I heard he was pretty.
He was extremely anti-Semitic. So this is actually this is pertinent right now. It is actually pertinent because anti-Semitism is actually, unfortunately, something very strongly associated with mythicism. And we'll get into it later on with the with other mythicists, but as well. So Bruno Bauer was he was anti-religious just in general, but he was specifically also anti-Semitic as a general rule. He viewed the Hebrew Bible as completely inferior as a work of art. He considered Jews to be more problematic than any other religious group in Germany at the time. He published a book called Die Judenfrage, the Jewish question, where he advocated that Jews should be forced to give up their religion because it was a destructive force of society. And this is where he actually had conflict with a student of his, Karl Marx.
Okay.
Karl Marx was a student of Bruno Bauer, took some theology classes under him, including a class on the book of Isaiah. And what ended up happening was Marx, despite what people have tried to make him out to be, was not inherently anti-religious. He think that he was against organized religion because he thought it was being used by the government to oppress the working class. He thought that what organized religion was doing was being used to make people content with their own oppression. His personal belief was that after Marxism was adopted, after socialism was adopted, that religion would probably just die out naturally of its own volition. People would eventually just no longer see a need for it, and it would collapse on its own. And that's where it came into complete conflict with Bruno Bauer, because Bruno Bauer and the young Hegelians, like Ludwig Feuerbach and others, were of the active opinion that religion should not only be removed, it should be actively oppressed, and that it should be attacked, basically. And Karl Marx thought that verbally attacking religion was a useless endeavor. He thought that he didn't think it was worth the time or the effort. And he got butted heads with Bauer over this because Bauer wanted him to actually join in starting an atheist journal with him. And Marx wouldn't do it because he didn't want to be associated with these anti-religious people. So they ended up having actually a huge falling out. Along with Friedrich Engels as well, ended up on Marx's side of this whole fiasco. Marx and Engels did not, either of them, end up as mythicists, despite, again, what like McClymond and Van Voorst have said. Mythicism did not actually reach the Soviet Union through Marx or Engels. It's just false. Engels was the most sympathetic to it of the both of them, but there's no indication that he was actively a mythicist at all. But they were very much against Bruno Bauer's anti-Semitism. Marx specifically because Karl Marx was a Jew. So it was very problematic there. Unfortunately, this anti-Semitism would become very much a trend of mythicism, that's associated with it. We see it, as I mentioned before, we see it with these white supremacist movements, and there's some other movements in early Germany we're going to see them with later on. But so basically, Bruno Bauer continued writing. He lost his position in the 1840s, and he continued writing up until his death in the late 1800s. his last major work was The Christ and the Caesars, and he argued that Christianity basically developed out of a mix of Philo's Judaism and out of Stoicism. And that was basically it. He did not really, that was as far basically as his pagan comparison went, honestly. He didn't get into the whole pagan god deities like the dying and rising gods and stuff like that at all, unlike most other mythicists. And this was something that those that closely followed him also did not usually adopt either later on. So this basically is how early mythicism looked. There are, on the other side of this, now we're going to move into the mid and late 1800s. In the United States, our earliest major figure in the mid 1800s is Kursi Graves. Everyone knows Kursi Graves at this point, even if it not by name. They know him specifically because he's the reason why the list of 16 crucified saviors exists. He published the world's 16 crucified saviors in 1875 in its first edition. It was fairly popular among free thought movements. It is worth noting that it did get quite a bit of backlash as well, including even from those that weren't actually Christians. Helena Blavatsky, who would start a bunch of the Theosophy movements, she actively called him out on some of this. She's actually particularly relevant. Everyone can keep her right there in the back of your minds, because she's relevant and it's gonna pop up again. So what we ended up having there is Kursi Graves was a quasi-spiritualist, but he was a free thought activist. Argued Jesus never existed as a historical figure. He did it almost exclusively by comparison to other mythological figures. His work was primarily based off of the work of Godfrey Higgins. Godfrey Higgins, we don't know if he was a mythicist or not, but his work Anacalypsis, which was uncompleted at his death, it is absolutely instrumental to astrotheology now. It is one of the most well-known works associated with it, especially to people that get into the Egyptian origins ideas of Christianity as well. Kursi Graves primarily was working off of Higgins. Looks like he also possibly was working off of Volney and Dupuy. It's hard to tell because he never cites anything. It's one of those people. He kind of just, the very, very rare occasion he cites someone, he just mentions their name. So his work became kind of influential in the United States. There were also a few early women getting involved as well. So his work was positively reviewed by Victoria Woodall. Victoria Woodall ran a journal specifically aimed at women, and she was an early women suffragist, and she was the first woman to run for president.
Wow.
Yeah.
And she was influenced by the mythicist works?
Possibly. It's hard to tell. All we know is that she positively reviewed Kursi Graves' work. That's all I have really to indicate she was involved in that. There were two other American women who were mythicists as well that I have found. The first is Elizabeth E.G. Evans. She was primarily raised and educated actually here in Michigan, in Ann Arbor. She was a polyglot. She was able to read and speak several languages, as her books attest and her citations. And she was also fairly well read for the time. She was an early advocate of Darwinian evolution, and tried applying that to how religion developed. Her first book was a history of religions, and in that book she wasn't a mythicist yet. She actually made an argument in favor of the historical Jesus. Despite this, she was still in the comparativist group. Specifically, she had a strong inclination to compare Jesus and Krishna. This was actually a very common trait among early mythicists, and still kind of exists in some groups today, as we'll see. So despite that, though, she was still historicist. She was a traditional historicist despite this. She shifted her position complete 180 later on. It's also worth noting she's kind of, it's like not surprising, but most early mythicists were pretty racist. Referring to other groups as savages and primitives and unevolved figures was not uncommon for Elizabeth Evans to do. The Jews were the Jews she described as bloodthirsty savages and primitives and things like that.
You know, I see this a lot, and it's not, I don't know, like, I guess it is a form of racism in a way, because I mean, like, for example, with the recent war that we had in the Middle East, I hear a lot of people talk about the people in the Middle East need to evolve. They need to step up to modern ethics in modern ways. And they technically are still a blast from the past because they're still medieval in their thinking and stuff. So I don't know if that's a derogatory sense, or was she using it in derogatory sense?
She was kind of using it in a derogatory sense, but it is the idea that people are, and their ideas are like medieval or less evolved than ours or anything like that is in and of itself ethnocentric and Eurocentric very much, because anytime like us over here are saying that they're unevolved, because we're saying it by the standards of people that have predominantly been influenced by Christian morality in our philosophy, and we have all this technology, and we have a pretty conglomerate view of what morality is and stuff like that. So it's, when we talk about people having these medieval views, it's a very ethnocentric thing to do, as if they're like someone is more moral or more evolved than anyone else.
I didn't want to get rabbit trailed into a bunch of that.
It is relevant to this discussion, though, because it is something that comes up a lot, unfortunately, in mythicism.
I guess, and this is just my personal pet peeve. As a Christian, I was hardcore fundamentalist. I was like hook, line, and sinker sold into the idea that, just an example, homosexuality is not only a sin, it's condemned in my mind, right? As a fundamentalist, you know, you are going, like, God should put you to death. Okay. To me, that's a harmful ideology, and it's not a good one, in my opinion. What someone's sexual preference is to me something that religion needs to leave alone. If they think that, that's fine, but don't impose that, standing there going out of your way trying to harm others because they might have a sexual preference different than you. And whereas if you go in the Middle East, you say, hey, by the way, I'm a homosexual, they will behead you. So we might have different practices where I go, you know, you guys are, you think rehabilitation is throwing someone in prison for 20 years in isolation. We're going to think one day, I bet you, when we look back with our science, we're going to look at that and go, how Neanderthal-like were we? Because we thought that was going to rehabilitate them. That's not how it works. So I mentioned that on a previous show. But
It is something we always have to keep in mind, is that hindsight is 2020. And then on top of that, we should not ever, in my opinion, ever be judging other cultures based off of our conceptions of morality, our conceptions of what's good and just. It doesn't make sense from an anthropological standpoint, because that instantaneously biases how we're going to actually view the culture, how we're going to view their ideas. Right. It actually makes it hard for us to view things objectively.
I get it.
So, it is something that's very relevant to this discussion, because when we get into the 1900s,
Yeah. Okay, I'm following you. I didn't mean to. I'm
But
following
yeah,
you.
Elizabeth Evans was definitely in that group. It was a racist time. She's a racist woman. End of story. It wasn't good. Her book, interestingly enough, following that, is a complete 180. She wrote her last book that she wrote was The Christ Myth. She wrote that, she wrote that on 1900 exactly. And basically the thesis of that book was Jesus did not exist, and her goal was to disprove Christianity. And what's interesting about it is that she seemed to have become a lot more conscious of anti-Semitism, because the goal of her book in the end, when she actually makes her final statements, is that now that Christianity is disproven, we should stop oppressing the Jews. It's a very interesting complete 180 that she did.
That's actually, I kind of feel the emotion of that, even if her arguments aren't. I get it, because look at what's been happening. Anyway.
Yeah. It was a very interesting book. It was a very sincere book. She argued primarily based off of comparison to other works that Jesus didn't exist, like comparisons to Krishna, Buddha, etc., etc. A very strong Indian influence for her argumentation. The other woman that was involved early in the 1800s, late 1800s, was Sarah Titcomb. She was part of what's called the mind cure group. She believed that all illnesses were actually just illusions of the mind and could be cured purely by the mind.
I mean, we had some weird. You're right. Hindsight's 2020, baby.
Yeah. Well, and Elizabeth Evans was of a completely different group that thought that no one should have sex except for reproductive purposes. Ever.
I'm going to hell. Yeah. No, I'm just kidding.
But yeah, Sarah Titcomb, she wrote The Aryan Sun God, or something, if I remember the name correctly.
Can I ask you something about this too? Because we're about to get into some there's going to be some obvious white supremacist stuff here. And I guess I don't want to steal your thunder. We might be getting to it, but I wanted to ask, as we're getting into this, does any of what occurred in Nazi Germany and some of the stuff in Russia and the racist tendencies, did mythicism play a role in any of these things?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I will get to those in detail. It's harder to track mythicism in Nazi Germany, but it's very easy to track it in Soviet Russia. Very easy.
Okay.
So, with Aryan Sun Gods, actually, surprisingly enough, was fairly well publicized. I have reviews of it from Calcutta. I have reviews of it from Germany. I have reviews of it from France, the United States, England. It was a very well disseminated book. Now, despite that fact, neither Elizabeth Evans or Eliza Sharples or Mary and Jane Carlisle or Elizabeth Evans, Sarah Titcomb, none of these women are usually ever talked about in this debate, ever. In fact, the only person I know of in this entire debate to have ever referenced any of them is Acharya. Dorothy, for those that don't know her actual name, Dorothy Murdoch. So yeah, these women, despite the fact that they seem to have had quite a bit of notoriety around, completely overlooked by modern scholarship on mythicism. Completely. However, their cohorts are usually mentioned, like Robert Taylor and Richard Carlisle.
And these girls probably went further than them. I mean,
well, yeah. I mean, Eliza Sharples outlived him and had an influence, and she had influence on an English mythicist we're going to talk about here in a second, Charles Bradlaugh.
Okay.
So, but yeah, this is basically what the United States looked like. We also know that, interestingly enough, we also know that during this exact same time, there were also tours going on for people trying to prove Jesus existed. There was actually a rabbi that I know was going around to different states and giving lectures on why Jesus existed. Now in England, mythicism publicly kind of drops off a bit after Carlisle and Eliza Sharples and Taylor drop off the scene.
Is this 1900s?
No, this would actually be a 1840s. So I'm going backward in time to deal with England now.
Okay.
So in England, mythicism kind of just dropped off, disappeared a little bit. It does still exist in some periodicals, but sparsely in comparison. Towards the end of the 1800s, though, 1880s and 1890s, pops back up. Boom. It primarily pops back up with figures like Charles Bradlaugh and Edwin Johnson. Edwin Johnson, we don't know a whole lot about. Looked to be an English school teacher of some kind. He was also a he had probably some of the wackier ideas. He didn't think that any of the ancient texts that we had were actually authentic in any way. And he thought that the Gospels and the epistles were all 15th century CE forgeries created by Benedictine monks.
I guess when you're working with whatever you got, I don't know. I mean, because can you imagine? I don't know. Today we have enough now to go, hey.
Yeah. So his theory was interesting. Question mark. He has actually had a little bit of influence on mythicists to the modern times, though. Despite this, he was around the same time was in Charles Bradlaugh. Charles Bradlaugh became very influential in running free thought organizations, and he published a book where he basically put forward a whole bunch of these early mythicists and said, you should check all these books out because these are excellent at disproving Christianity. So like Boone, Taylor, Carlisle, the works are all in them. He seemed to have been a mythicist himself. His mythicism in particular was not particularly influential, except to one person who is going to be very important in the beginning of the 20th century, John McKinnon Robertson, who is probably to this very day, is one of the single best known mythicists in history. So that's kind of how it was in England during this time. Primarily, it's periodicals, free thought movement. It's not super well publicized anymore like it was during the time of Taylor and Carlisle, which is ironic because censorship had greatly lessened by this time as well. So where in France, we also start to see some early mythicists starting to pop up as well. One of them is the famous novelist Edward Jouadin, who is going to become very important as in the debate to some extent. In Germany, we don't have very much at all. Basically, by that time, the liberal theologians had basically taken over. And so all these liberal theologians are arguing Jesus existed, and they're emphasizing his humanity over any of actually the mythology. But during this time, we do have a specific group in Holland appearing, the Netherlands. These are our personal favorites, the Dutch radicals.
Yay, Dr. Bob. Chris, You froze on me,
So
brother.
the Dutch radicals were primarily coming about. Oh, there we go.
You froze. Okay, you're back.
This. There we go. Is that better?
That should be better. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, the Dutch radicals basically came about as a result, it basically developing in the modernist movements in Holland at the time. They're very greatly influenced by the liberal theologians in Germany, like F.C. Bauer. And then they are also very much becoming influenced as well by Hegel. You can see the thrilled expression on my face. So the first quasi-Dutch radical, I consider a Dutch radical in the proto sense, is Sietse Hoekstra, writing in the 1860s and 1870s at the start. He argued, he was not a mythicist at all, but he argued that the Gospel of Mark was useless for reconstructing a biography of Jesus. This has become a trait of the Dutch radicals later on. There's also then Allard Pearson. Allard Pearson is usually considered the father of the Dutch radicals. He argued that it was his lecture on the Sermon on the Mount and his published work on that basically started this. Argued that he would prototype what was basically to come. Didn't think any of the Gospels could be used to reconstruct Jesus. Didn't think that there were authentic Pauline epistles. All the good stuff. He was not, however, taking from Bruno Bauer yet. Bruno Bauer would come into influence with the later Dutch radicals. So he influenced Abraham Dirk Loman. Abraham Dirk Loman ended up publishing a lot on arguing against the authenticity of Galatians. He came to the conclusion that Jesus did not exist. He actually gave a lecture on that. That lecture actually became so popular among the Dutch radicals that followers of the Dutch radical school would actually commemorate the day and have celebrations on it later. Not kidding. It's almost religious in a way. It's quite interesting. For those that actually want like a good brief history of it, I'd highly suggest checking out Herman Datering's The Fabricated Paul. Pages like 45 through like 60 have a good history of it. There's also during this time, as then coming up, we have Willem Christian van Manen. Willem Christian van Manen was not a mythicist of any kind. There have been a few people that have tried to say he was, like Robert Van Voorst errantly put him in that category. He thought Jesus existed. He also thought Paul existed. He did not think that Paul wrote any of the epistles we have, though. And he is by far the most influential of the Dutch radicals today, and that's primarily because he wrote several articles in English. And for those interested, all of those articles have been edited and put together by Dr. Robert Price.
Here's a fair question, I guess. And you've read these things, which, by the way, I'd love to get if you can get some of the sources, like just give me, not all, there's so many, but like a list of these. I'll put them down in the description of the video so people can go and do, well, let me read that person. Let me read that book or whatever. And they can dig up their own. You've read these Dutch radicals, at least to some degree, I suspect. Do you have can you see why they're making their case? I mean, do they have good reason to think like they do? Or, I mean, you may not agree with their case, but do they have any good substantial things that get your attention as to why they think that way?
So there are a number of things that are actually very interesting about their case, and that I see as partially credible. So one thing that they have going for them, that was substantial to their arguments, was first actually discrediting the power of the signature statements at the beginning of the epistles. I am Paul, blah, 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 blah. They thought that those were all problematic. And so one of the traits of the Dutch radicals was basically that they could not treat those as they were not going to treat those as authentic because they thought there were a bunch of problems with them. They'd compare them and be like, look how long these things are, or these things are kind of they seem a little inconsistent between the letters. They also argued that the part of the argument was based off of the work of the Tübingen School started by F.C. Bauer. So that school thought that only 4 of the epistles were authentic. The problem was that these Dutch radicals would then make the argument that, well, look, all the language in these epistles looks very close to these ones that you think aren't authentic. So why don't we just consider these not authentic? Others argued that there were indications that these were also piecemeal compilations.
Patchwork, yeah.
Yeah, which Dr. Price has very much indulged in his own work, The Amazing Colossal Apostle. The work, from my own perspective, I don't think that these arguments are that credible anymore. They are very interesting for the day. I personally consider it a problem of skepticism for the sake of skepticism. But that is my position.
Okay.
I have found that the argumentation of the Dutch radicals were pretty much ignored mostly during their day. There are a few responses available that people can read to them. There was a response by Benjamin W. Bacon in his commentary on Galatians. There was a response in Otto Fleiderer's Primitive Christianity in 4 volumes. You can only this commentary is available in reprint. These are not, unfortunately. There was also there were like 2 or 3 other responses made. There was not a whole lot made in detail against them. Most theologians didn't find them particularly credible. Another problem was also because they were writing in Dutch. Dutch was a relatively niche language. Not very many people spoke it outside of the Netherlands and a few in Germany. So it wasn't something that people were had wide accessibility to, which made it hard. Those that did respond to the Dutch radicals usually were responding to Willem Christian van Manen because he wrote in English and he wrote several articles for Encyclopedia Biblica. He also published a few in like some periodicals. Most of them didn't have a whole lot of response. Today, there has been some response though from a very, very good scholar, Edward Verhoef. His articles are, for the most part, I think all accessible online. So I could actually give you guys links to them, to the PDFs. He gives, in my opinion, what is an argument in favor of the Pauline epistles being authentic, and I think it's pretty conclusive. I also think that the thing that shifted Willem Christian van Manen's perspective on the Pauline epistles was not actually really about the epistles themselves, but actually the development of Christianity. Because he had problems figuring out how Pauline and Petrine Christianity were able to develop in the time frame of how Christians traditionally put it, because he viewed them all as linearly one after the other, basically. So he didn't see how the time frame worked unless the epistles were inauthentic and later in date. This is in contrast to his dissertation. His dissertation was written defending the authenticity of 1 Thessalonians, and I think that his argument was solid. And his argumentation is quite closely what's actually replicated by Edward Verhoef. For those wanting actually a rundown on Willem Christian van Manen, there's a Edward Verhoef has a great article in this book. It's called The Rise of Historical Consciousness Among the Christian Churches. His article is literally just, his article is entitled, let me get it. I swear I'm good at this. It's entitled The Dutch Radicals Espoused Historical Research as the Basic Principle of Their Study. It's a very good article, highly suggest it. There is also one other work from the Dutch Radicals that is in English now. It is the Dissertation of Hyoma Boone. He did not, to my knowledge, really get into discussions of the epistles, but he was closely associated with Abraham Dirk Loman. But he focused on the Gospel of Mark, and he actually argued against Markan priority. So this is his dissertation. It has been translated in English as A History and Critique of the Origin of the Markan Hypothesis, 1835 to 1866, a contemporary report rediscovered. It was translated by John Hewitt.
What's his priority in his view, Matthew?
I believe so, if I remember correctly. It's been a little bit since I read it. But he basically argued against Markan priority because he actually points out that Markan priority at that point was not actually argued for based off of much actual historical consideration of the text. It was actually argued for primarily based on theology.
Okay.
And so he made serious criticisms of the academics of his day because of that. It's actually a very good work because he was holding the academics of his day very much accountable for their theological biases.
Interesting.
So yeah, this was basically what the Dutch Radicals were like. There was one other Dutch radical that was of note, and that was Van den Berg van Ansiednia, who was the student of Willem Christian van Manen. Unlike Van Manen, he became a mythicist. He promoted the Indian origin of Christianity theory. This theory would later become one promoted by Herman Datering today. They did not have very much influence out of their own circles. They were primarily located at Amsterdam and the University of Amsterdam and University of Leiden. And they were associated with the publishing house Brill, very famous today. Other than that, not much. They did have some influence in this debate, like they influenced John McKinnon Robertson and Arthur Draves, but that was about it. They didn't really themselves get too closely involved directly, usually just through proxy.
Did they, and I don't know because I haven't read them, did they were they influenced by the idea of mimesis from Old Testament? Is that where they conclude Jesus is a rewrite of the Old Testament, or what was their particular angle on why Jesus didn't exist?
It depended on the author.
Okay, there's different opinions.
Yeah, there was no universality but with their mythicist positions at all.
Okay.
So it's hard to tell always. Van den Berg van Ansiednia thought that he actually went for a comparativist route with Indian religions, with Hinduism and Buddhism. With Abraham Dirk Loman, I believe he went into some of the Old Testament as well, but it all just varied.
That's pretty cool. I've never heard anyone talk about the Dutch radicals, on that level. Yeah. That's pretty cool.
So in the book I'm working on, I have an entire chapter devoted to them, actually.
They deserve it, man.
Yeah, especially because they're they're a group that's not really talked about a lot, except for usually just in passing now. So other than this, then we now are going to start moving into the 1900s. Late 1800s, we have our first case for mythicism in a newspaper in Greece pop up as well. We have the first indications of it in Italy in addition. So I'm going to move actually to Germany now, because in the 1900s is primarily where mythicism is going to have its major focal point, is actually in Germany. And to do this, I have to actually take us back and get into a little bit more history, because there's an entire movement we have to understand in order to understand where mythicism got its start. And this is the monist movement. Particularly, we need to understand Ernst Haeckel. Ernst Haeckel was an early Darwinist zoologist and biologist. And he was a little bit extraneous in his views. He didn't always actually keep up with the current research on Darwinism. What he became convinced of was that they basically should start a religion based on Darwinism. And when I say that it was a religion, that he thought of it as a religion, I'm not kidding at all. He thought you could apply Darwinian evolution to basically anything. The two books that I would suggest on this, for those interested, is Daniel Gassman's Haeckel's Monism and the Birth of Fascist Ideology, and The Scientific Origins of National Socialism, also by Gassman. So Haeckel was also, in addition, a raging anti-Semite and an anti-Christian. So he came around, by the time that the early 1900s were coming around, a monist movement had begun in Germany. He had started basically it was the German Monist League that had begun. It was an official movement, and it was initially run by Albert Kalthoff. Albert Kalthoff was originally a German minister, and liberal theologian. He ended up becoming a monist and gave up Christianity and became an anti-Christian. And then he became president of the German Monist League and he rediscovered the works of Bruno Bauer. Albert Kalthoff is basically like reviving the work of Bruno Bauer. Bruno Bauer's work, it's been commonly said, this is another trend in mythicism, it's been commonly said Bruno Bauer's work was just forgotten about and kind of put by the wayside, even censored. Only one of his works, to my knowledge, was actually ever censored. The rest of them don't ever seem to have, and they actually seem to have been actually fairly present in the mind, actually internationally. People seem to just have known about him. So his works weren't exactly forgotten, but Kalthoff basically was taking his works to a new level and combining them with his monist ideas. He wrote 3 books on the topic of Jesus's historicity. One of them has been translated into English. I don't have my copy of it here, but it was called The Rise of Christianity. And his thesis is basically identical to that of Bruno Bauer. If you know Bruno Bauer, you basically are going to know what Albert Kalthoff said. But basically, there's not a whole lot I'm going to talk about with Kalthoff here, except that where he had a lot of influence and where another figure would have influence is on Arthur Dreves. Arthur Dreves is probably the single most well-known and arguably most important mythicist to have ever existed. He was a German philosopher from the University of Karlsruhe. He studied monism. He was a monist himself. He was inspired by Hegelian philosophy and by Schopenhauer and others. And he was a different kind of monist. He was what's called an idealist monist. But basically, he came to the conclusion that due to his religious beliefs, he could not believe that Jesus existed. He was religiously motivated to think Jesus didn't exist because of his monism. The idea of God becoming incarnate in his monism was nonsense. Therefore, Jesus did not exist. His book was single-handedly probably the most controversial. In all of history, his book is easily the most controversial that has ever existed. It was called De Christus Mythe. It went through 4 different editions. The 4th one has never been translated into English. It was a 2-volume set because it was so large. The 3rd edition did get translated into English under The Christ Myth by C. Delisle Burns in 1910. His book was first published in 1909 after the death of Kalthoff, who influenced him. It was primarily motivated after he was reading the work of W.B. Smith out of Tulane in America. W.B. Smith was a white supremacist and mythicist. His white supremacy work is absolutely horrific on every level.
People,
but,
man.
Yeah, his mythicist work, was the progenitor of the view of a pre-Christian cult worshiping a figure called Joshua, which is where Drews gets his idea of it from. So basically, when we get to Drews is basically a conglomerate of all these different ideas we've been seeing. He's taking from Bruno Bauer and Kalthoff. He's taking from the astrotheology. He's taking from the comparative route. He's taking from the Dutch radicals. Everything is just kind of being intertwined in this mass conglomerate argumentation going on here. And he became super popular because he had a massive publicity plan going on in coalition with this. So he'd go around Germany giving lectures on this. He published a bunch of pamphlets on this. It became such an international sensation that right after it was published, there were people all the way in Los Angeles, California, writing about this. He ended up publishing a debate. He ended up in a debate with numerous theologians. Actually, to date, he is the mythicist with the most responses in history. Before his death, there were over 100 published in literature. Peter DeMay recorded 86 himself. I've recorded a further 30.
That's crazy, dude.
It's absolutely insane. I actually have one of them here. This is an original from 1910. Jesus gelebt by Hermann von Soden. Hermann von Soden, the big part of this was that there ended up being a huge debate in 1910 at the Berlin Zoological Gardens between Hermann von Soden and about 3 or 4 other theologians and Arthur Drews. The debate was organized by the German Monist League, and it was heavily slanted in favor of the mythicists. Heavily. It garnered an audience so large that they couldn't fit everyone in. It was heated beyond all natural reason. At one point, one woman apparently got up and screamed that Drews was going to burn in hell and stormed out of the auditorium. And then there were mass protests that eventually happened. And in fact, there was one protest they organized for around 5,000 people, but because the protest was so large, they had to organize a second one in another city in order to accommodate everyone. The international response was massive. He was receiving responses in Russia, in India, in America, in France, in England, in Germany itself, in Denmark. Everyone wanted to bash this man into the ground. So it was quite remarkable. It was one of the most remarkable spectacles of the early 20th century. After that, basically after the mid 1910s, though, no one gave a shit anymore. Germany basically came to the German theologians after he was responded to en masse. Basically, were like, "This matter's decided, and you've lost." That was the end of it, for the most part. In America, it was pretty much over by the 1920s. Germany, it was pretty much over by the mid 1910s.
Was his writings really, were they good? I mean, not only were they,
He's one of the
broad, but was he
he is
pretty
one of
good
the
at
most,
defending mythicism?
the arguments actually aren't that great.
Okay.
Arthur Dreves was not considered actually the strongest of the mythicists of his day. The reason he was so popular was just because of the publicity tour that followed him. In fact, the publicity was so much that apparently even Kaiser Wilhelm II made a statement on it, according to one of these books up here. This one right here. Search for Jesus by Mikhail. Yeah, it was a very interesting development, but his arguments were not usually considered the best. Most of them actually considered Albert Kalthoff and some of his other contemporaries to actually be better at arguing for their case than Dreves. So what ended up happening, though, is after that is basically there was no one else that ever actually garnered that much of attention. In India, there were two major mythicists that were actually going around making arguments, but they were completely ignored by everyone else in the world. Dreves had a direct influence in Japan, specifically on Shusi Kotoku. I'm probably butchering that pronunciation. I am sorry, Japan. But he was an anarchist, very much inspired by Marxism and socialist ideology. He wrote his own book called On the Obliteration of Christ, where he argued that the cross was a phallic symbol and that Jesus never existed, and a bunch of other stuff. And he is primarily working off of Dreves, Ernst Renan, and a few other older theologians. He didn't have access to a whole lot of work at that time. His work also did become massively influential, though. Not in the Western world. It's never been translated into English, ever. It was translated into Chinese, and some scholars argue that that book probably made its way to the desk of every single historian in all of China. It became the official position of the anti-Christian movement in China. It did have an influence in Korea, from what I can tell. So yeah, and then where Dreves was also then very important was in Russia, which I think I will spend most of the rest of this time on. And then because most people know about the modern stuff, I'll just say one quick thing about modern mythicism, because we can focus on that maybe in like another video. But the whole idea that mythicists have been ignored by academics is a complete myth. I have endless records of responses to mythicists throughout the 20th century without stop. To think that we have like ignored them in academia as historicists is just wrong. It's a myth on both historicist and mythicist sides, because historicists do it because they don't want to give mythicism credit. Mythicists do it because they want to be a victim. They're both wrong, completely. But basically, where mythicism had its most acceptance widely among academics was in Soviet Russia, and it was through Arthur Dreves. Arthur Dreves' Christ myth was translated into Russian in the 1920s. The German edition came to the hands of Vladimir Lenin, and Lenin wrote specifically that it should be adopted by the state. And it was. And it was adopted big time. The Soviet Union took Arthur Dreves' mythicism, made it the official position of the Communist Party. It was put into propaganda. It was used specifically to motivate anti-religious sentiment. It was specifically used to indoctrinate children. In Germany in the 1950s, some 80,000 textbooks were printed supporting mythicism to be used in elementary and high schools, or well, our equivalents anyways. in East Germany and in Yugoslavia. And in fact, in Yugoslavia, they ended up killing over 200 priests that in one go under President Tito. People who were part of the historical school. Russia basically divided themselves into two schools. There was the mythological school and the historical school, as they called it. People who were a part of the historical school were declared active enemies of the state. There were mass debates put out publicly, but this is really funny, actually. So despite the fact that there were all these mass debates, apparently the Russian government eventually dissuaded people from actually doing them, and the reason is because the historicists were usually better read and usually had more knowledge of the ancient texts. So when it came to the debates, the historicists would usually swamp all of the mythicists completely. So what ended up happening was that the League of the Militant Godless, which was well known for actively persecuting Christianity in the name of atheism and then using mythicism as one of the tools to do this, they actually started what were called anti-religious universities and tried to train people specifically to take on and defeat Christians and to destroy the historical Jesus. The universities didn't really work very well because most professors refused to become a part of them. So they were able to. And what was really funny was even those that did end up working out, even after they would have their students go through, their students were still so underprepared that they'd usually get swamped anyways in the debates, even after the education process. However, mythicism became widely accepted, usually under force, because in Russian historical academia, it became used in it became the official position of the Great Soviet Encyclopedia. It was the only academic encyclopedia at that point that actually held a mythicist position. And so just it was widely used. It was broadcasted over radios in the 1950s over Christmas. On Christmas Day, they actually put out a radio broadcast saying that Christmas was a pagan holiday and Jesus never existed and a whole bunch of other stuff over Radio Moscow. And then after that, there were numerous scholars like Alexander Kazdan, Yosef Krivlev, and Nikolai Rumiastev, and numerous others that all promoted these views. Usually they were associated with some atheist organization that was specifically promoting this as an official position politically. This actually remained the official political position of the Soviet state until it dissolved in 1991. Now this, however, mythicism in Russian academia shifted hard. In the 1960s, basically as they were beginning to let up on academics, and also especially after the Qumran discoveries were becoming more widely known, academics basically began shifting their views en masse. By the beginning of the 1970s, most Soviet academics were no longer mythicists, including Alexander Kazdan. Alexander Kazdan had been actually one of the most fervent mythicists in the early decades of the Soviet Union, and completely did a 180 after the discoveries of Qumran. In addition, others began taking positions, even those that didn't think he existed, usually shifted into agnosticism. Nikolai Rumianstov actually ended up giving up most of his comparative ideas and began focusing more on Jewish origins for Christianity at that point as well. So he basically gave up a whole bunch of Drev's talking points. So basically it went from being a forced position that was actively used to oppress academia and all used to brainwash children, and then completely changed over.
I think
One of the
it's important to note that the discovery of the Qumran and Nag Hammadi might play a role, but I know the Qumran, from what I understand, is a very interesting one because that gets you into a real messianic mindset real quick and find out there's a lot in common. I'm not saying it's identical, but I'm sure these scholars are well read. We're seeing stuff and going, oh my gosh, like this
yeah.
is fascinating material. So
Yeah, and so there's a few works I actually want to talk about specifically from around here. So the first one I actually want to talk about is a novel that was published during this time. It's called The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. The first chapters are very well known among academics, specifically because he satirizes the hell out of the Christ myth debate. He presents a mythicist atheist named Berlioz, who is so set in his ways that when Satan himself comes to Russia and tells him that Jesus existed, he won't believe him.
oh, that's good. That's funny.
Berlioz then eventually gets his head cut off all good fun, right?
Right. All peaceful, loving. Yeah.
Yeah, it is honestly very great. But Mikhail Bulgakov was writing in the 30s and the 40s. He had direct access. We know for a fact he owned a copy of Arthur Strauss's book, and he was using that predominantly for his satire. But he was also surrounded by mythicism. In fact, in one place where he published a short story, if I remember correctly, at the end of that newspaper article, or the periodical, there was an article promoting mythicism in it.
Wow.
So basically everywhere that you went, it was being promoted. H.G. Wood, actually, who wrote Did Christ Really Live? Right here, reported that when he came to Chicago, the Russian Workers' Party there actually was having promotions and propaganda for mythicism as well. This is in the 1930s in Chicago. So this book was actually very funny, and it became very, very widely disseminated. The other book that was extremely influential was Father Alexander Men's The Son of Man. He was a Russian Orthodox priest. He had to publish this actually outside of Russia, and he had to publish it under a pen name because otherwise they probably would have executed him for his Christian faith. But unfortunately, the appendix was not translated in the English edition, but the appendix is where he rebutted to mythicism in full. Spent several pages on it, and in my opinion has some of the best arguments against mythicism that there are. Focused on like those who would use trifo. You had a hugely excellent grasp of the current literature, of the research that had been done up to that point. He was a brilliant academic. So basically, after Alexander Men's book in the 60s, which became also widely disseminated, and they think it. There are others that have said it's basically reached every single nook and cranny of Russia by the 70s. But basically because of that, mythicism basically just collapsed. While it was still the official state position, the state no longer had that hold that they used to have, and so they could no longer enforce it like they did. Because academics had dropped it en masse, the populace had dropped it for the most part. Basically, that was it. It was over for that. By that point, there were 2 mythicist scholars I know of left. The only one that wrote any book on the matter, and it's available in English. You have to track down a copy, and they are hard as fuck to find. Was Joseph Krivlev's Christ, Myth or Reality. It was published in the 1980s. This book basically this is a trend in mythicism, is that the arguments that mythicists have 9 out of 10 times are recycled from older work, even if they don't know it. The dying and rising gods goes back to the 1800s. Most of all the deities and narratives they're going to compare been used since the 1800s. There's not very much original in mythicism at all. Yosef Krivlev is very much a sign of this. His argumentation you can basically find very closely paralleled in Arthur Drev's. There's not a whole lot different. But his work, when he died in the 1990s, that was basically the end of mythicism in Russia. It is not accepted in academia in Russia to this day. There's an article, you have to be able to read Russian, but there's an article available online documenting the history of mythicism in Russia. Basically, by the time the 90s rolled around, there was no academics left promoting it in Russian academia at all. When Yugoslavia collapsed, as we all know, and so that whole hold of mythicism there fell apart. Mythicism also had a complete reversal in Romania. It also had been a forced position there, but basically in the 1990s, Romanian theologians and academics reversed their positions as well. East Germany as well completely reversed it. It basically at that point there was not really much of anything left. And in fact, after the 1930s, mythicism as a whole worldwide was on a downturn. At least in academia. Paul-Louis Couchou in France was the last one that had any major hold in French academia. He was the last one also that had a massive responses made in the 1920s and 30s. And basically those responses discredited him mostly, like the work of Maurice Josuel, Jesus the Nazarene. Basically, at that point, no one regarded any of his work as viable after that. So in India, no one cared. China adopted mythicism only for a very brief time period. It wasn't very important to them in academia. Japan, it never caught on, apparently, not majorly. To my knowledge, it hasn't caught on in the Koreas either. In Germany, it actually got supplanted in World War II. Because the problem of this was the rise of Nazism. Because the official Nazi position was that Jesus was an Aryan. So they thought he existed. They just thought he wasn't a Jew.
Dude,
there was one Nazi mythicist I have a record of, Hans Obermeister in Berlin, who wrote a series of pamphlets where he was part of the Volkisch movement as well. The Volkisch movement was basically a revival of Norse paganism with Nazi ideology. He wrote several pamphlets arguing that Jesus never existed, Peter never existed, Paul never existed, etc., and then argued that everyone should worship Odin.
yeah, you have no axe to grind, my friend.
Yeah. So I mean but other than that, there wasn't very much left of it in Germany. Nazis basically had just adopted that he was a historical figure, an Aryan, but yeah. So at that point, basically what ended up happening in Germany, East Germany, as I talked about before, that was taken over by the Soviet Union. That was influenced by mythicism from the Soviets, and then all that collapsed when mythicism basically was reversed en masse as a position of academics. And then West Germany was all historicists, because they're basically all working with the rest of the academics over in France and the United States and England. John McKinnon Robertson was the most influential mythicist in England. Huge a number of responses made to him as well. He's probably, in my opinion, the second most responded to figure. But after the 1910s, he fell off the radar. No one cared about his work anymore for the most part. He still published several works up to his death. None of them were heralded. Same thing with W.B. Smith in the United States, probably the third most responded to of the time. Again, his work was responded to en masse, several responses. After the 1910s, academics regarded mythicism as a moot point. It was refuted to them. So
I guess I was going to say, I guess that because we could go into, I'm pretty sure, a pretty good podcast on just the 19th, 20th century and today, and like the varieties of mythicism today, and like
yes,
it just different ideas. I guess my question, because I wonder if we should pause it here to go into on our next show.
It'd probably be a good place to pause, because now we're basically done with Russian, and basically the only thing left is modern mythicism.
Yeah, and why did it revive? Like, what happens? Who, what, when, where, and why. And then also, I wanted to ask for our audience to say, because this was very historical and very educational. Very, very few biases came through on your part, which was good. You were a mythicist, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And how long were you a mythicist?
A few years.
Few years. You've read quite a few books on mythicism, so I would say
several hundred at this point.
Wow. Okay. So here would be my obvious question. I am a mythicist, right? Let's just say, which I'm actually agnostic, to be realistic. I really don't know. I mean, I'm very open-minded to there having been an actual guy at the root. I'm definitely open-minded. As you can see, I have you on my show. Like, please share with me the information. I'm a mythicist, and I want you to give me a one-stop shop. I'm not as well read. I can't read 200 volumes. I really want the best place to go to say, this is the strongest case that I've seen in like a one-stop shop, refuting the idea of we're really not even necessarily refuting it, but like giving a positive position on showing that there was a historical Jesus. Is there something like a one-stop shop that you would recommend? I know that's a hard one. That's probably the hardest question you've had asked in a while.
Yeah, that's a really hard one, because there is such a huge variety of responses. How about I give a few? There are a few.
And we'll reference these down below too.
Yeah, I don't think I could give just one.
Please.
Modern literature, Robert Van Voorst's Jesus Outside the New Testament is easily one of the best works out there. I personally consider Maurice Casey's book to be Jesus, Mythicist Myths, or Evidence and Argument to be very decent as well. Most of the criticisms that Carrier has of it, I don't think he read all of it sometimes. But the older responses, there are actually some older responses that actually still stand.
Oh, really?
In my opinion. Yes. Two of the best books are by the same author, and this will also give you some of the best historical overview of the time. T.J. Thornburn's Jesus the Christ, Historical or Mythical, and then also his book, The Mythical Interpretations of the Gospels. Both of these you can find digitally online in various places. Otherwise, they've not actually been reprinted to my knowledge. So as you can see right here, I have original editions. This one is from, when is this? I believe this is, these editions are ancient and fragile. This is from 1912. and this is from 1914.
That's cool.
So if you want those, you have to basically track them down. Those, I think, are the best cases. The best cases against the Dutch radicals, again, is Edward Verhoef's work. I think his work is absolutely flawless for the most part. Maurice Josuel's work with Jesus the Nazarene was excellent. Shirley Jackson Case's The Historicity of Jesus was excellent. Bart Ehrman's book is okay as a starter. Has problems for sure. There are so many.
You need to list them because yeah, we'll do that.
I will provide you for the description below. I will provide a bibliography of works you can check out on all of this.
Do that, man. I'll definitely post it out there, and I'll be waiting for you to write your book at some point because you're a researcher. Of course, you're working towards putting some credentials behind your name, which is really, really cool. I can't wait for that to happen so that you can actually be able to say, hey, look, I have credential. I have credibility here in this discussion. I could see a book coming out sometime, The Myth of Christ Mythicism. You know what I mean? Like a derogatory, kind of like a hat, but you're not really being derogatory, but it's like the myth of Christ Mythicism. And so I could see stuff like that. I like to entertain both sides, which I think is a very good decision to make. Personally, I don't close off just because majority does side on one side or vice versa. I mean, at one point, if I was majority, I might have been mythicist. So, I would look at this argument. I think it's a very good question. I think you've even said that on previous show where you're like, it is a very important question.
Yeah. It's a question that should exist.
Yeah.
It needs to happen. Yeah. I think it's an important question. I think people should ask, did Jesus exist? And I think that should be challenged. I am thankful that mythicists exist. I think that is a good thing they exist. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think some books are bad, but that's a different issue. That's not saying the idea and the argument and the fact that that's a thing is bad. I think mythicism is kind of essential because mythicism, in my opinion, is probably one of the most instrumental things to modern historical Jesus studies because of how it actually influenced our methodology. Because mythicism very adequately took down a lot of what the liberal theologians were doing. It is an extremely important part of history, and it's extremely important to have now. It shouldn't stop existing. And I don't think we should be taking the existence of Jesus by fiat by any means.
Right.
So yeah, funnily enough, when you go through the history of this, historically, I actually have more traits associated with mythicism than I do historicist. I'm a feminist. When I switched over to historicity, I was an atheist, involved in atheist organizations, which are usually pro-mythicist throughout history. This is one of the greatest trends, is that mythicism is usually associated with organizations that have an anti-Christian agenda, like American Atheist, Prometheus books. Usually, if they have some kind of secular or atheist agenda, that's where mythicism's popping up.
Is it wrong of me that I poke at Christianity all the time on my YouTube channel?
No.
So the agenda
Poking needs to happen.
Yeah, my mom's a Christian. My mom, and she calls me all the time, and she says, "Derek, please say a prayer right now." And I do. I'll do it right there in front of her, and I mean it. I'm like, you know what? Okay, Mom, because I love Mama. I always will. And I say, "Dear Lord, if I'm wrong, have mercy, because I'm trying to figure things out, and I don't understand everything there is to know. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen." I'm an actual atheist by definition. Even though I'm agnostic, because I don't really have, I can't say with knowledge of knowing that there is no, but I have no reason for me to believe in a deity, so to speak, even though I've had some strange experiences in my life. So it's like, I don't know, I'm a weird dude. But
I mean, personally, right now, I am a theist.
Okay.
but I'm not a Christian. So
Okay. You're a
I have,
theist? You're not pantheist?
no, I'm actually a polytheist.
So polytheist. Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
Is there a particular like path in which you could put a label on it, or
I'm a Canaanite polytheist.
Canaanite?
Yeah.
Dude, you went old school, bro. I'm gonna have to look. Yahweh's telling me to come and find all your men, women, and children. No, I'm just kidding.
No, but yeah, historically, I'm actually mostly, with all the groups and associations I have, Marxist. I'm a Marxist. I'm a feminist. I'm a polytheist. I've been mostly associated with atheist organizations in the past. Like, I actually have more traits associated with mythicism than I do with historicity.
Right.
So I have more reason to actually be on that side.
But you're convinced there's more reason with methodology and such that you're on the side you're on.
Yeah.
There's many reasons you take your position. I understand.
Yeah.
What made you, if you don't mind me asking, this is outside of history, it's a great history lesson. We're going to get into further history lesson. But if you don't mind me asking, because we're all on a journey, right? Everyone who's watching this has been on a path. There's a reason why they're watching this show and even made it this far. They're interested in the history, they like the question, or they themselves are Christ Mythicists or historicists. And, you know, we all go on our journey, but what led you to take a position from atheism to a polytheistic Canaanite position? Is it not the evidence necessarily or was there something convincing about the religious view that you liked? What?
It was a mixture of the argumentation and then also personal experiences. I regard personal experiences as a legitimate form of evidence. For personal.
Right. You're not imposing.
Yeah.
I
don't think personal experience is evidence for other people, and I don't pretend that it is, but
Right.
it is evidence of what you experience.
Subjective.
Yeah, it's subjective. I don't have a problem with it. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. If I'm
Right.
wrong and no deities, it's not like it's actually going to change anything.
If you don't mind me asking about the Canaanite God, am I going to hell if I don't believe in him, or is that like not in their religious?
Everyone's just going to shale.
Okay, whatever that is.
We're all just going to shale. That's it.
So I'm good. I'm cool in your book.
Yeah. I don't. The thing about most polytheists is that we don't have any stringent beliefs about anything, at least in terms of you have to believe this, you have to be in the in-group. Like, no, we're very pluralistic, so we don't have problems with atheists. If you're an atheist, doesn't bother us. If you're a deist, doesn't bother us. If you're a pantheist, doesn't bother us. If you have a different pantheon, doesn't bother us. I'm a more of a universal figure. I think all the gods exist. I don't have a problem with it.
So you're kind of like a Baha'i polytheist ish. Not, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to throw you in that group. I'm just saying you kind of see there's importance in all different things in a way.
So
okay.
Yeah. Now, in terms of Christianity, I have a different perspective. I don't think Jesus was. I think Jesus was a historical dude.
Yeah.
And that's where it ends.
Right. And there's a lot of myth too, so you're not throwing that in, you know.
I mean, my personal opinion of the entire quest to the historical Jesus, I think it's misguided. I don't think we can know really much about, if anything, about the historical Jesus.
It's still fun to speculate. I mean, especially when something clawed us so deep for so long.
Yeah.
You actually mentioned on a previous podcast that, and it is still to this day made me think, I heard different versions of this, but that this man may have actually blasphemed. There may have been a guy who literally treaded waters he shouldn't have in a messianic sense, which made him red flag to the leadership in that time that said, hey, dude, this guy blasphemed. Like, we need to get rid of him. Do you still hold that position that he claimed to be divine, or you're just kind of like, I don't even know. It's just throwing it out there.
Maybe. I don't know. My position at the moment is he existed. He's probably killed by the authorities. That's it.
And they built off of this. He was probably somebody important to this group, this small movement.
Yeah. He was important to this small little group of people, but I think that basically everything we have is mostly invented. I basically think that what little we have in Paul is about what we can say.
And even that's so weird, dude.
Like I
Just
don't,
for me.
yeah, I think he had a brother named James, maybe multiple brothers. 1 Corinthians 9:5. I think he probably had some apostles, like Peter died.
You think Paul freaking faked himself into this thing, or do you think he just had a subjective personal experience where he?
I think I don't have any reason to really doubt he had some kind of personal experience. It doesn't. It's not something surprising, and something that happens pretty frequently.
I mean, you had one, right? Like a
Yeah. It's something that having the experiences of deity is something very common.
I just had to do this at the end. You were really cool with this, and I really do appreciate you coming on and like not only sharing the history, which, you know, just going into different ideas. You did a good job of not like bashing the mythicists the whole time. You did show though that there was some obviously bad ideas attached, but one thing that I did appreciate is you didn't say the motivating factor for mythicism in every single case was just this. It's just horrible ideas that made them have to be mythicists. Now, there were some you described and discussed, and I'm sure there's more you didn't touch on, which we've talked on previously.
Yeah, but there are some that are honest to goodness, just mythicists because that's where they think it led them.
Right.
Thomas L. Brodie is a Dominican priest who is a mythicist.
Why would you go there? Yeah, good point.
There's also there's a pastor in the Netherlands, Van der Kaj. He's also a mythicist. There are some that just come to this in a very honest way, not out of really these biases. This is just where they were led. It's not. It is actually interesting. In the case of Brodie, because Brodie basically shows that if you disprove the historical Jesus, it doesn't actually disable Christianity. It doesn't for Brodie.
It
just makes him a more fervent believer. So,
I mean, really, the only person that really matters in Christianity anyway is the Christ, not necessarily the Jesus. We talked about that.
Well, yeah, and it's also just because of the problem with those that take up mythicism for this scorched earth approach, which Dr. Price has talked about. Basically, that it's because they have this really black and white view of myth.
Mm-hmm.
Either if something's myth, it's false. If something is true, it's true. And there's no room for myth to also impart truth.
Right. And that's a big mistake. Yeah. There was a temptation to do that too when I was researching this. I went down the celestial path. In fact, for me, I saw a lot of what appeared to be celestial language, and it is there, but that doesn't mean the whole dag-nab thing is. And that's what I thought. I thought if I find elements of astrotheology, as they call it, or, you know, star myth, whatever, then the whole thing's probably this secret allegory. And I went down that path. Now I'm beginning to look back. The way I described it the other day to someone was I'm walking into a dirt lot, and some people are saying, no, there's a concrete base there somewhere. And I'm like, dude, I see nothing but dirt, right? I went the celestial route. Everything's dirt. Then I started sweeping a little dirt away and realized, dude, there's a little bit of concrete down here. What is that? And then I started realizing the more dirt I start to sweep, I realized you can have dirt on top of concrete. And it's like, oh, okay, well, maybe it can be a mythologizing way of history. And that might be the way they wrote.
Yeah, well, yeah, and that's how they wrote. All of their history is mythologized. So, like, when you see, this is one of my biggest critiques of mythicism, actually, is that usually all of the standards they have for, like, invalidating the Gospels as historical sources are things you can apply to virtually any historical source at all in the ancient world. Historical sources were mythologized. That's just how they wrote. Herodotus euhemerized Hercules and tried to make Hercules historical. Herodotus wrote using very specific literary styles, like they call it ring cycle, chiastic structuring. This is used in the Gospels. It's used in ancient biographies.
Genesis, yeah.
Yeah, this is just how they wrote, and and so we can't use these standards to say that this is just not historical.
The
What it
hard part
tells
is
us
trying to
is
really
that
know
what it tells us is that there are trends of how they wrote.
Right,
Even
right.
even Mimesis criticism doesn't tell us that things are not historical. It tells us that this is how they're shaping things. So sure, you can draw on all these different works. You can draw your influences from pagans. I could concede every single argument mythicists make and still be a historicist.
That's a fact. I actually described that with Camille in the last show. I said, it's hard, Chris. I know you know where I'm coming from when I say it's hard. Let me voice the mythicist in me, if you will, to say,
Sure.
Yes, you're right. It can be myth that's overrun the historicity. So let me give you where I'm coming from with this. If what we did with mimesis, all right, I see a rewrite of Moses technically in this modern context, and for some reason, well, they don't say Moses' name, and there seems like there's different little players in the story that did exist by Josephus' standards and others in that contemporary context of when this is supposed to be taking place. And I go, I feel like at the bottom here, there's something that the author's trying to say, but it's so fictional. It appears it's so rewritten. It's like peeling the onion away, and you're like, what is the basis? And then when you get to try and finding it out, you'll never know. So they wrote it in such a way that to know with certainty, I can't. I can't and fairly. The only thing I could personally assert in this is Jews were crucified often in the first century. This guy was claiming to be a Jew, even though there are these radical white supremacist versions of mythicists and whatnot. And there's other groups that are not mythicists that are historicists, like the Christian identity groups and a variety of different groups that are historicists that believe he was white or believe he was black or whatever. But I just want to point out that at the end of the day, it could all be myth. And all we have left in history in our hands is all myth or extremely mythologized stuff. And there could have still been a guy. And that's the crazy thing about historicity is at the end, they could still say, got it. I agree. You could say all your dying and rising gods do have some type of connection. You could say everything you want. And at the end of the day, this guy was cherished and in a perfect time in which they were able to do this and still be a historical person at the basis. That's what's crazy about it.
Yeah. I can actually take the same standards and apply them to the Caesars. We know that apotheosis and translation narratives were a mimetic tool often used. Richard Miller published a book on this. That was a common mimetic tool used throughout the ancient world, and it was probably used in the case of Jesus. We know for a fact that a lot of the birth narratives and all sorts of other things were usually shaped by some mimetic structure. So I can actually look and show how accounts of the Caesars, like Augustus, are shaped mythologically to a heck of a lot of high extent. We know Augustus Caesar existed. Like it when we talk about history, we're not talking about certainty. We look for probability.
Right.
So we can be reasonably, we can come to the conclusion with a reasonable high degree of probability that Julius and Augustus Caesar existed.
Yeah.
Even though we also have accounts of them being translated into the heavens by the gods. These were just common tools that were being used. And so when you see these tools being used, none of these are indicative of a historicity. And that's like my biggest problem. Every single argument that can be made, that's usually made for the ahistoricity of Jesus, never actually indicates that.
See,
all these arguments make is what they indicate is mythology is being used.
This is what hurts me in my brain. When I look at the New Testament, I wish we found some literature that did not get so mythologized. I wish we had something a little more down to earth, so to speak, not so so highly mythologized, if that makes any sense. Like if you were to read Caesar Augustus or something and read people who wrote about these guys, yeah, there's some stuff in there. Josephus did this. Everybody did this. Like I'm reading about Jesus ben Ananias and I'm like, dude, this sounds a little bit hyped. Like how did Josephus know that at the death when the actual catapult came to crush Jesus ben Ananias, his last words were, woe upon me? I mean, like, how do you know? Like, there's fictitious, cool elements that are built into the historical narratives.
Or Vespasian is the basic messiah and a healer and prophet kind of a figure. And
yeah, it's really cool. I find beauty in that, but like, there seems to be more. There's some type of not concrete, but more tangible stuff that isn't so hocus pocus. And then when I run to stuff like Paul, he's so weird. I don't mean in a bad derogatory sense. I mean, he's weird. Like for me, maybe I just don't understand the world around them and I need to research more and read more on this, but he's worshiping, I don't know. It appears that he's got a strange Jesus. He's got a very strange Jesus Christ, Lord Jesus Christ. And it's definitely different than Judaism in so many ways. So I'm not familiar with the mystery schools. That might be why I need to investigate it more. I don't know, but everything we have written on him is just not.
Stoicism is the one to look at.
Okay, Stoicism.
Yeah, he was very much he made a lot of use of Stoic language. He did make use of mystery language as well, but mostly Stoic language.
Christine Hayes was mentioning that, and I was like, okay.
Yeah, there's actually two good books that have been published on it. One's John G. Cook's Empty Tomb, Apotheosis and Resurrection, or Resurrection, Apotheosis, sorry. And there was another one that was just published, and I don't remember the name of it, but I'll get it to you for the description.
Yeah, just put together something. How do you? I know you're not on the web anymore, like much. I'm not saying you won't come back. We will eventually, when you get the book, definitely go into the book and get that out there. Do you have any ways of contact that you put out there, or is right now we're just going to hold off and?
I don't really have much in the way of contact information anymore. I'm not really handing out my email right now. Okay. I'm mostly, part of this is because I am trying to be more reserved to focus on my research. That's why I've mostly withdrawn from online activities. So
I don't blame you. Well, I really appreciate you going through this. Next show we're going to do, let us know also your thoughts if you're watching this, but next show we're going to go more into the 19th, 20th centuries and to modern mythicism and some of the ideas that are floating around today. Has mythicism taken evolution since it spawned? Are there different ideas? And are there some interesting ideas? Do they have some things right, some things wrong? I'm looking forward to that. That'll be a fun one. I really do appreciate you joining me, man.
Thank you.
Yeah, and don't forget, we are Myth Vision.